Private videotape was aired on international TV of Rodney King being beaten by 4 police officers. The first camcorder came out in 1982. The image gave everyone a sense of the violent attitudes black people endure every day. It was a startling reminder of the systemic racism deep in the authority structures of U.S. justice, further inflaming desires to fight centuries of racial injustice in the New World. Gorbachev's opening of the structures that formerly kept the USSR behind the Iron Curtain also made them vulnerable to the law of competition, taken advantage of by the USA. Rather than allow the measures to form a different USSR, the USA worked to bring their rival down. The nations that made up the USSR, who were taken over by previous regimes, began to feel a stronger sense of their own identity. The once powerful nation fell apart. It was soon discovered that the Red Menace was not as menacing as the propaganda projected.
The movie The Lawnmower Man examines the question of power corrupting and absolute power corrupting absolutely as a man gains power over reality by expanding his mind in a virtual world.
Rex Diggins publishes his work on fair, accountable assessments, laying the foundation for the accountability agenda, which ramps up in 1995 as educators begin to realize that technology is changing the social environment to one in which they do not provide children the power to compete.
De Klerk's resolve to dismantle apartheid in South Africa signaled a mounting intolerance for systemic racism, though the term systemic racism would not come to prominence for another 20 years. The shift in policy allowed the release of Nelson Mandela from 27 years in prison. De Klerk saw the removal of this policy of racial segregation as essential for the development of dynamic programs directed at better education, health service, housing, and social conditions for all. Despite right-wing and extremist opposition, De Klerk's efforts dismantled apartheid in
1994. Meanwhile, Daniel Goleman introduces the idea of emotional intelligence, which evolved into international studies on the importance of social emotional learning. SEL is the development of an awareness of how the self and others are affected by emotional reactions. Since emotions motivate action, SEL is essential for the understanding and initiating of personal influence. The ability to take positive risks also requires an awareness of how much risk one can handle. It requires a strength of conviction that a risk is worth taking for personal growth.
The Dipperwash inquiry in Ontario, Canada, revealed that Dudley George was shot by a sniper when the government directed police to end the standoff. The Kettle Creek and Stony Point First Nation occupied the park to assert claim to traditional land expropriated for an army camp during World War II. The inquiry symbolized potential changes in the relationship between government and Indigenous peoples by having accountability for systemically racist decisions.
Meanwhile, the accountability agenda in education sought to improve learning results by collecting copious amounts of data. Push for data-driven educational improvement put all the pressure for learning improvement on the backs of educators. In 1997, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, instituted the Program for International Student Assessment, which influenced a general practice of high-stakes testing to determine educational success, increasing the numeric push to credentialing. Jack Kevorkian fights for the rights of individuals to choose how and when they die. For his efforts in providing people a death without pain or loss of dignity, Time magazine names him Person of the Year and labels him Dr. Death. Meanwhile, Robert Sternberg introduces his work on how people think, proposing a complex structure with three thinking styles based on political functions: executive, legislative, and judicial, containing four forms of thinking: hierarchical, monarchic, oligarchic, and anarchic, operating within two scopes, internal and external, with two positional leanings, liberal or conservative. The PLC was adapted for education from the work of Peter Sent on learning organizations. It offered the promise of deep systemic change through a critical analysis of organizational purpose. As implemented, it became a complex system of assessment and data collection, as well as a method of surveillance for teacher performativity.
Professional learning communities can improve student learning,
or simply elevate scores on high-stakes tests, often at the expense of learning.
They can heighten the capacity for community reflection that is at the heart of teacher professionalism.
Or they can enforce collective compliance with prescribed programs and pacing guides, prevalent in the USA, which demean professionalism.
The things that pass for professional learning communities can broaden children's learning in terms of their curiosity about the mastery of themselves in their world.
Or force an almost exclusive focus on literacy, math, and standardized basics.
The systems set up to implement PLCs constructed rules of discourse around values that require an organized or structured mechanism to identify the desired values and teach them. Those teachers who don't want to live up to the new expectations end up transferring or being put on a plan of action. The principal must be willing to insist that a teacher who works in isolation change their behavior.
Two students from Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado entered the school with semi-automatic weapons and murdered 12 of their fellow students and one teacher. They then killed themselves. The shooting raised concerns about school violence and gun control in the USA. Many schools hired private security to ensure student safety.
The NRA blocked ideas of gun control to protect rights written into the U.S. Constitution to carry guns.
ASIMO, whose name is an acronym for Advanced Step in Innovative Mobility, was first dreamed up way back in 1986. That's when Honda Associates first proposed creating a humanoid robot that moved and walked just like a real person. Soon after, Honda dedicated a team to do just that. Issues of power and responsibility inherent in achieving a balance of justice resonate throughout this 10 years. They emerge in the startling awareness of systemic injustice embedded in the mindset of people in positions of privilege and authority. They languish in the collapse of totalitarian regimes, even though helped by foreign interference. They are put into question by access to media that camcorders and later cell phones provide. The rise of the self gives rise to the question, what about me? This goes with the communal equivalent, what about us? Some people, as with the clerk, also ask, what about others? Helping others could help us. Accountability for actions becomes very important. The demands put on education to meet the expectations to compete in a changing economy make accountability a means of surveillance. The promise of change in PLCs is subsumed in an agenda of what about us. There are the advancements in AI and robots that look more like people. We are more able to replicate ourselves in machines. To do this, we must know more about how people think. We must also know more about learning. But education is not about learning. It is now about competing in a world of learning machines.